Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about David Lee Fisher's film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a 2005 remake of the original Robert Weine film from 1920. It's a weird movie. This is not a silent film, so it does differ from the original in that sense. There's at least one additional important character. Jane's brother is not really in the original. He may be sort of kicking around on the margins, but he doesn't really do much of anything. Whereas in Fisher's remake, after Cesare abandons Jane in the course of kidnapping her, Jane's brother sort of pursues him and stabs him to death with his own knife, as opposed to the Weine version in which Cesare just sort of dies. He dies presumably of exhaustion, but it's not... ironic that a somnambulist who spends almost his entire life asleep dies of exhaustion, but he sort of just arbitrarily dies in Weine's version. Here, he actually gets killed by Jane's brother. So we got those differences. The dialogue is okay, and I say that with a big asterisk on it, because I think the idea of the dialogue is really that it's meant to be this sort of stilted, awkward, quasi-old-fashioned, but not really old-fashioned, just very odd dialogue. And so I think it's meant to sort of evoke this is the silent film era. Dialogue is awkward. Because, that kind of is the case, right? With silent films where you have the text screens, right? Where we'll say, here is what this character has just said. It's like, okay, that's very awkward, but sure, we accept that. It's early 1900s, up through the 1920s. Sure, whatever. It's olden times. At the same time, there is this sort of horror sort of element to it, this sort of psychological horror element to it, which is, of course, very, very appropriate for Caligari. The sort of sense of a disconnect between the characters and the awkward stiltedness of their language really suggests that things are not as they should be in this film. You combine that with the fact that it's filmed in front of green screens, and then the actors are sort of superimposed on the original set from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the 1920 version. That was a set design, that was an expressionist set designed to feel surreal, designed to feel awkward, to feel menacing. And sort of adding that green screen element on it, on the one hand, it's probably in some sense better than trying to recreate that scenery. But it's 2005 green screening technology, so it's not really amazingly amazing in some places. Sometimes it looks fine, but then sometimes, especially, I noticed this a lot, when Jane turns in profile, just the front of her nose was ill-defined against the green screen. I don't know why, but that was one bit that just really jumped out at me. But there were definitely parts where you're like, okay, yeah, I can tell that's green screen, and it's kind of breaking up the whole illusion. But that's also kind of not a bad thing in some way, because, again, there's this tension within Caligari about what is true and what isn't. And so having that sort of, this is clearly green screened, this is clearly fake in some sense, that element really sort of undercuts those notions of certainty. And the other thing that sort of undercuts notions of certainty that's sort of central to this is that there's a lot more dialogue in this. At least there's a lot more dialogue just because it's a talkie. And we don't usually say talkie anymore, but in contrast to the silent film version, it's a talkie. There is spoken dialogue. And so that's much easier than having to put up a title screen for each, say, phrase of a conversation. So silent films don't tend to run on an economy of conversation, whereas talkies do. And so, because there's a talkie, there's a larger volume of dialogue, and a lot more of that dialogue focuses around questions of whether or not Francis is perceiving things accurately, whether or not he is actually the one who's insane, etc., etc. There's a lot of suggestions, verbal suggestions throughout, that maybe Francis, our protagonist, whom we're supposed to believe is a sane, reliable narrator, that Francis may in fact be an unreliable narrator, that his perception of events may not be trustworthy. We get this throughout. And then, of course, that foreshadows the big reveal at the end, which is that Francis, in the frame narrative, Francis is actually the one in the insane asylum. Caligari is actually not Caligari, but he's the psychiatrist, the head of the insane asylum, who is treating Francis. Also, apparently, his friend Alan is not dead. His friend Alan is an orderly in the insane asylum, which I don't think was in the Weine film. That adds an additional level of creepiness to it, in a way. But all of that all these sort of hints of maybe I really have gone insane. Maybe I'm just perceiving things wrong. This definitely foreshadows the ultimate reveal at the end. But it's also a weird thing, right? To remake a movie like Caligari, because one of the things about Caligari that was so shocking in 1920 was that reveal at the end. But it's also one of the most famous films in cinema history. It's super influential. Film people know Caligari, although apparently general audiences don't necessarily know Caligari that much, because I've talked to a number of people in my sort of community theater group and other places, and not that many people know The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So that's really surprising to me. But it's a famous film nonetheless. Decent chance that by 2005, many people in the audience, particularly I think this premiered at a film festival, many people in that audience are likely to know the ending of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So that big reveal kind of isn't a big reveal. Like, if we watch the whole movie, knowing that at the end we'll find out that Francis is actually in the insane asylum, then first off, all of the references to him maybe not perceiving things correctly, him maybe being insane, that's much, much more apparent than it otherwise would be. But we also lose that shock value, right? There's a sort of weird thing about this, and this is part of the thing with adaptation, right? Is adaptation, according to Linda Hutchin, is repetition with critical distance. And this aesthetically has that critical distance. Is the repetition too repetitive, then? I don't know. It's an interesting question. Does this film work if we assume an audience that's a primary audience at this film festival, at least, that's generally knowledgeable about the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, if they aren't going to be surprised, does the film still work? Or does it just work in a different way? It's an interesting question.